Hello, my name is Alad Zohar with Making Space in Music, and today we'll talk about style. So style is something that's very, very important for conductors. I think it's a very, very important way to help the musicians recognize what they're actually supposed to be playing and how to interpret the little black dots on their pieces of paper. So in general, when covering style in fundamental conducting, I'll say that there's four main categories. The first being neutral, second being legato, then staccato, and then accented. Now before we go any further, if you haven't already, I'd say go back and watch video 3 on how we cover focal point conducting, because that's what I'm going to be using for the most part in this video. We're just going to be talking about 4/4 and covering our style from there. So, neutral. What does neutral look like? Neutral is basically a note that doesn't have any articulation markings on it at all. And it'll look like this. Again, when we do this, we're basically trying to show as little tension in the body. In general, when we use neutral, it'll be when we want to feed only time information. It might even be something where musicians aren't even playing and it's a percussion break, and the percussion is listening to each other and interpreting style on their own. So your main focus is just to feed time to the rest of the ensemble so that when they're marching, they can maintain time in the feet. Moving into legato. Legato is something that's used more in the slurred or tenuto articulation range and will look a lot more smooth, but as a marching conductor, it's very important that we continue focusing on giving a clear articulation at our ictus, regardless of what the hands are doing the rest of the time. So when we're dealing with legato, the gravitational look will actually be something we're gonna lean away from and try to create more smooth motion by taking advantage of the wrist fulcrum over the entirety of the rebound. So it'll look something like this. Notice that as I go through that, I still want to try and keep my focal point as consistent as possible and make sure that my wrist reaches the end of its rotation at that point so that it's still as clear as possible. This is beat 1. Because if we smooth through that, like we would in orchestral conducting, it'll be a lot harder for a member on the 15-yard line to interpret time the same way that somebody on the 50-yard line would. So now let's talk about staccato. Staccato are obviously detached notes. And so what we'll do is we'll try and spend as little time at the bottom as possible by just increasing the velocity at our ictus. And that'll look something like this. So when we're dealing with staccato, we don't want to stop motion altogether like we would in stop time. We would actually like to have a little bit of bounce to the feel, but we do increase the velocity at the bottom so that we can make it clear to the musicians, you are playing only here and not here. But by increasing the velocity around the ictus, we're actually training the musicians to recognize that the articulation is a very, very important element of what we're playing right now. The final fundamental element would be accented, and this is a technique that basically puts a lot more weight on the front of our notes and kind of combines ideas with our staccato style. So here's what it's going to look like. So in general, when considering how we handle accented notes, it's very easy to recognize that I am trying to make my turnaround and my ictus just as articulated, just as quick as I am with staccato, but I am creating still a lot of motion by actually just increasing the size of my pattern. And that's essentially what an accented note is, right? We're firmly articulating and making the front of the note louder than the rest of the body and the tail end of the note. So now we've got our 4 fundamental styles. Let's just talk about a quick exercise you can do at home to make sure that you're practicing and developing your ability to go through each of these styles and transition from one to the next very, very easily. So the simple exercise goes as such. We'll rotate through each one of the 4 styles that we just talked about: neutral, legato, staccato, and accented, but basically conducting in any time signature that we want and rotating every bar. So it would look something like this, starting with neutral, legato, staccato, and accented. This is something that I would highly recommend looping by putting a metronome on, standing in front of a mirror, and watching yourself and observing whether or not you're actually achieving the feel of each of these different styles. It is something that isn't necessarily the most intuitive and might take a bit of practice, but I'd highly, highly recommend putting this in your back pocket and making this part of your conducting arsenal as we move on through this series and through your conducting career. With that said, my name is Alad Zohar, and I'll see you next time.